The telegraph arrived on a day when the wind carried the promise of rain, yet the skies remained a stubborn, unbroken blue over Placerville, Colorado. Lillian Harlow stared at the paper in her trembling hands, reading the words for the third time, willing them to change. The message was brief, just like the man who'd sent it. Marriage proposal rescinded. Regrets. Jonathan. 4 years of correspondence, of dreams woven from ink on paper, undone in 3 cold words delivered by a sympathetic telegraph operator. It was 1878, and at 22, Lillian faced the bitter prospect of remaining unmarried in a town where eligible men had become as scarce as rainfall. She crumpled the telegram in her fist, the paper crushed as thoroughly as her hopes. The wedding dress hanging in her bedroom window seemed to mock her now white satin that had cost her father half a season's earnings from his small mercantile store. Lily. Her mother's voice drifted from the kitchen. What did the telegram say, dear? Lillian smoothed her expression before turning. Jonathan's been delayed, she lied, the words tasting like dust. The wedding will need to be postponed. The lie would buy her time to figure out how to tell her parents that the man she'd been corresponding with for years, the man who'd proposed marriage and promised to come from Denver to claim her as his bride, had changed his mind. Margaret Harlow wiped her hands on her apron, concern lining her weathered face. Delayed, but the Reverend, the guests, everything is arranged for tomorrow. I know, Mama. Lillian tucked the crumpled telegram into her pocket. I'll speak with Reverend Miller myself. Placerville had been founded during the silver rush of the 1860s. Now, as the mines began to yield less, the town clung stubbornly to existence. The Harlow family had come west when Lillian was just 12, her father convinced that opportunity awaited in Colorado territory. For her parents, perhaps it had. For Lillian, it had meant growing up in a place where women were outnumbered 4-1, and most men were either too old, too young, or too rough for proper consideration. Jonathan had seemed different. A businessman from Denver, educated and refined. Their courtship by letter had given Lillian hope that she might escape the narrowing confines of her life in Placerville. Now that hope was gone, crushed beneath the weight of 3 stark words. Outside the modest clapboard house, Lillian paused to compose herself. The afternoon sun beat down on the dusty main street. Shopkeepers stood in doorways, seeking relief from the heat that lingered despite summer's end. Across the street, Mrs. Bailey's boarding house displayed fresh curtains, readied for Jonathan's arrival. Lillian felt a fresh wave of humiliation. She walked with determined strides toward the small white church at the edge of town. Reverend Miller would need to be told, the wedding canceled, explanations made. Each step felt heavier than the last. The church door stood open, allowing a faint breeze to stir the stale air inside. Reverend Miller sat in the front pew, Bible open on his lap. He looked up as Lillian's shadow fell across the threshold. Ah, Miss Harlow, come to check the arrangements for tomorrow. Lillian's throat tightened. No, Reverend, I'm afraid I must ask you to cancel the service. The older man's brow furrowed. Cancel, but my dear, your guests will be arriving. Jonathan isn't coming, the words escaped in a rush. He's rescinded his proposal. Oh, my child. The Reverend closed his Bible and moved to take her hand. I'm so terribly sorry. Lillian hadn't intended to cry, especially not before the Reverend, but his kindness broke something inside her. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she sank onto the hard wooden pew. The shame of it, she whispered. Everyone will know. They'll pity me, or worse, they'll laugh. No one who knows you would laugh at your pain, child. But Lillian knew better. In a small town like Placerville, gossip was the primary entertainment. By nightfall, everyone would know that Jonathan Prescott had jilted Lillian Harlow, leaving her at the altar. What will I do? She asked, more to herself than to the Reverend. You'll endure, he answered simply. God doesn't close one door without opening another. She nodded, not believing but unwilling to debate theology while her heart was breaking. When Lillian left the church, the sun was beginning its descent behind the mountains. She walked slowly, dreading the moment she'd have to tell her parents the truth. As she neared the general store her father owned, a commotion at the far end of the street caught her attention. A group had gathered outside the saloon, voices raised in greeting. A rider had come to town, nothing unusual in itself, but the response he garnered suggested someone known and welcomed. Lillian paid little mind. Travelers passed through Placerville regularly, though few stayed. That evening, as twilight settled over the town, Lillian finally confessed the truth to her parents. Her mother wept quietly while her father paced the small parlor, his face darkening with anger. "That lily-livered coward," he muttered, "couldn't even face you like a man." "What matters now," her mother said, dabbing at her eyes, "is what people will say." "I don't care what they say," Lillian insisted, though she did. She cared terribly. "You should care," her father countered. "Your reputation, my reputation." Lillian stood suddenly. "I've done nothing wrong." "Jonathan is the one who broke his promise." "That may be, but it's not how people will see it. They'll wonder what you did to drive him away. The injustice of it stung." "That's absurd." "It's the way of the world, Lily," her mother said softly, "fair or not." That night, Lillian lay awake in her bed, staring at the wedding dress that hung like a ghost in the corner of her room. Tomorrow, she was supposed to have worn it down the aisle. Tomorrow, she was supposed to have become Mrs. Jonathan Prescott. Instead, she would face the townspeople's curious stares, their whispered conversations that would cease as she approached. Morning came, harsh and bright. The church bells would ring at 11, not for her wedding now, but for the regular Sunday service. Lillian considered feigning illness, but pride wouldn't allow it. She would face them all with her head held high. Her mother helped her dress in her second-best gown, a muted blue that complemented her eyes. Her fingers worked nimbly, buttoning the long row up Lillian's back. "Perhaps we should leave Placerville," her mother suggested. "Your father's cousin in Boston has often invited us to visit." "And abandon the store, Papa's work," Lillian shook her head. "This is our home, Mama. I won't be driven away by shame." When they stepped outside, Lillian was surprised to see the street already busy with activity. It was early yet for people to be heading to church. A wagon had arrived at the mercantile across the way, men unloading crates while others gathered to inspect the new goods. "What's happening?" she asked her father as he locked their front door. "New shopkeeper," he replied. "Bought old Peterson's place. Arrived yesterday, I'm told." Peterson's store had been closed for months after the elderly owner's death. Its reopening might be good for the town, though less so for her father's business. Competition was something they could ill afford, with the mines producing less each year. As they walked toward the church, Lillian kept her gaze fixed ahead, ignoring the stairs. Whispers followed them like shadows. Supposed to be her wedding day, left her at the altar. What do you expect? Plain as she is, each comment cut deeper than the last. Lillian had never considered herself a beauty, but neither had she thought herself so lacking as to deserve abandonment. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her Bible tighter. The church came into view, its white steeple reaching toward the cloudless sky. And then the bells began to ring, their sonorous peals calling the faithful to worship. The sound that should have heralded her wedding now marked only another Sunday, another ordinary day in an ordinary life. Something inside Lillian broke. The tears she'd fought to control spilled over, streaming down her cheeks as the bells continued their relentless tolling. "Lily," her mother murmured, squeezing her arm. "Compose yourself, dear, people are watching." But Lillian couldn't stem the tide of emotion. 4 years of correspondence, of dreams built on promises, all shattered with a single telegram. The bells rang on, oblivious to her pain. As they neared the church steps, a murmur rippled through the gathering congregants. Heads turned toward the far end of the street. Lillian, blinded by tears, didn't notice until her mother's grip on her arm tightened. "Who is that?" Margaret Harlow asked, voice pitched low. Lillian wiped at her eyes and followed her mother's gaze. A rider approached, unhurried but purposeful. He sat tall in the saddle, shoulders broad beneath a dust-covered duster. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face, but even at a distance, there was something commanding about his presence. "Must be the new shopkeeper," her father muttered, "showing off for the Sunday crowd." The stranger drew closer, and the crowd parted to allow his horse passage. As he neared the church, he slowed, then stopped altogether. For a long moment, he surveyed the gathering, his gaze moving deliberately over the assembled faces until it came to rest on Lillian. She felt a jolt of recognition, though she was certain she'd never seen him before. Something in his eyes so intensely blue they seemed to pierce the distance between them, held her captive. The stranger tipped his hat slightly, a gesture that might have been directed at the crowd in general, but Lillian knew with inexplicable certainty that it was meant for her. Then he turned his horse and continued down the street, dust rising in his wake. "Who was that?" Lillian asked, her tears momentarily forgotten. "Xavier Quinn," replied Mrs. Whittaker, the milliner whose shop adjoined the Harlow mercantile. "Rode in yesterday afternoon. Bought Peterson's place outright, they say." "Quinn," Lillian repeated softly. The name felt strange on her tongue, foreign yet somehow significant. "They say he came from Santa Fe," Mrs. Whittaker continued, clearly relishing her role as information bearer. "A man of means, judging by his purchase. Though what brings him to a dying town like Placerville is anyone's guess." "Placerville isn't dying," Lillian's father protested. Mrs. Whittaker sniffed. "Tell that to the mines, Mr. Harlow." The church bells concluded their summons, and Reverend Miller appeared in the doorway, gesturing for his flock to enter. As Lillian moved to follow her parents inside, she cast one last glance down the street, but Xavier Quinn had disappeared from view. Throughout the service, Lillian found her thoughts returning to the stranger. His appearance had provided a welcome distraction from her humiliation, giving the townsfolk something new to speculate about besides her failed wedding. For that alone, she felt a spark of gratitude. Reverend Miller's sermon that Sunday focused on faith during trials, a topic that seemed almost tailored to Lillian's situation. He spoke of Joseph, sold by his brothers yet rising to greatness, of Ruth, widowed young but finding new purpose, of doors closed and windows opened. "The Lord's plans are not always clear to us," he intoned. "What seems a tragedy may be the very thing that leads us to our true purpose." Lillian listened, wanting to believe but finding it difficult. What purpose could possibly be served by her public humiliation? What good could come from Jonathan's betrayal? After the service, Lillian braced herself for the condolences and curious questions that would inevitably come. Mrs. Peterson, the postmaster's wife, was first to approach, her thin face arranged in an expression of sympathy that didn't reach her eyes. "My dear Lillian, such a terrible shame about your young man. These things happen for a reason, though, don't they? Perhaps he wasn't the one God intended for you." Before Lillian could respond, another voice cut in deep with the faintest hint of a drawl. "Excuse me, madam. I believe you're standing in my way." Mrs. Peterson turned, affronted, to find herself face to face with Xavier Quinn. He stood taller than most men in Placerville, his shoulders filling out his dark coat despite its travel-worn appearance. Up close, his features were striking: a strong jaw shadowed with stubble, those remarkable blue eyes, and a mouth that looked as though it rarely smiled. "Well, I never," Mrs. Peterson huffed, but she stepped aside nonetheless. Xavier Quinn nodded briefly to her before addressing Lillian directly. "Miss Harlow, I presume?" Lillian's surprise must have shown on her face, for he added, "Small towns have big ears. I've heard your name mentioned more than once since my arrival." Heat rose to Lillian's cheeks. Of course he'd heard likely the entire sorry tale of her abandoned wedding. "Yes, I'm Lillian Harlow, Xavier Quinn." He extended a hand, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. His grip was firm, his skin warm and calloused. "I've acquired the mercantile across from your father's store, so I've heard. I find myself in need of local knowledge. Perhaps you might spare me some time tomorrow to discuss the town and its needs. It would help me determine what inventory to stock." The request was so unexpected that Lillian momentarily forgot her embarrassment. "You want my advice on your merchandise?" A hint of something that might have been amusement flickered across his face. "Unless you're otherwise engaged," the irony of his choice of words wasn't lost on her. "No," she said, lifting her chin slightly. "I'm not engaged at all, Mr. Quinn." This time the amusement reached his eyes, warming them. "Tomorrow, then, shall we say 10 o'clock at my store?" Lillian was acutely aware of the stares they were attracting. The conversation, innocent as it was, would fuel gossip. A jilted bride speaking with the handsome newcomer, it was too delicious for the town's gossips to ignore. "I'll be there," she said, partly out of genuine interest and partly out of defiance. Xavier Quinn tipped his hat once more. "Until tomorrow, Miss Harlow." With that, he strode away, leaving Lillian to face the speculative glances of the congregation. Her father appeared at her side, eyes narrowed as he watched Quinn's departing figure. "What did he want?" "Business advice," Lillian replied. "He's asked me to visit his store tomorrow." "Business advice," her father repeated skeptically. "From you?" "Yes, from me." Irritation flared in Lillian's chest. "Is that so difficult to believe?" "Watch yourself, Lily," her father warned. "Men like that, drifters, cowboys playing at being businessmen, they're not to be trusted." "I hardly think a man who can afford to buy a store outright is a drifter," Lillian countered. "All the same, be careful. Your reputation's precarious enough after Jonathan's." He trailed off, apparently unwilling to name what had happened. "After Jonathan jilted me," Lillian finished for him. "You needn't tiptoe around it, Papa. Everyone knows." Her father sighed, the anger in his expression softening to concern. "I only want to protect you, Lily." "I know," she squeezed his arm, "but I'm not a child anymore. I can manage a business conversation with Mr. Quinn." That night, Lillian found herself standing before her bedroom window, gazing toward Peterson's Quinn's store. A light burned inside, silhouetting a tall figure moving about. What had brought Xavier Quinn to Placerville, and why had he singled her out for conversation? She told herself his interest was purely practical. As a newcomer, he needed information, and as the daughter of his competitor, she possessed valuable insights. Yet something about the intensity of his gaze when it had locked with her suggested motives beyond the merely practical. Lillian turned from the window and faced the wedding dress still hanging in the corner. With sudden resolve, she removed it from its hook and folded it carefully, placing it in the cedar chest at the foot of her bed. Perhaps one day she would find use for it. Or perhaps she would take it apart and repurpose the fabric, transforming disappointment into something new. Sleep came fitfully that night, her dreams a confused jumble of wedding bells that became church bells, of Jonathan's face that somehow morphed into Xavier Quinn's, of roads leading away from Placerville and then circling back, morning dawned clear and warm. Lillian dressed with more care than usual, selecting a green gingham dress that complemented her auburn hair. She told herself it was simply proper to look presentable for a business meeting, but a small, honest part of her acknowledged that she wanted to make a favorable impression on Xavier Quinn. At precisely 10 o'clock, Lillian crossed the dusty street to the newly reopened store. The faded sign above the door still read Peterson's General Goods, though a smaller placard had been nailed beside it, under new management. The bell above the door jangled as Lillian entered. The interior was much as she remembered it from Peterson's day, though considerably emptier. Most of the shelves stood bare, awaiting new stock. Xavier Quinn stood behind the counter, examining a ledger. He looked up at her entrance, and for a moment, Lillian thought she detected surprise in his expression, as if he hadn't expected her to come. "Miss Harlow," he greeted, closing the ledger. "Punctual, I appreciate that in a business associate." "Is that what I am, Mr. Quinn, a business associate?" He studied her for a moment before answering. "That depends on whether you're willing to provide the insights I need." "And what insights might those be?" Quinn gestured to the empty shelves. Peterson left the place nearly stripped. His family took most of the inventory after his passing. "I need to know what this town needs, what will sell and what won't." "Couldn't you simply observe my father's store to determine that?" A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I could, but I suspect you might have ideas your father hasn't considered." Lillian was surprised by his perception. She'd often suggested items her father dismissed as frivolous or unnecessary. "Perhaps I do. Then share them with me." He moved from behind the counter, revealing his full height. Today, he wore a simple white shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle. Not the arms of a lifelong shopkeeper. What does Placerville need that it doesn't know it needs? Lillian considered the question. "Books," she said finally. Not just practical manuals, but novels, poetry, the miners and their families' hunger for stories, for worlds beyond these mountains. Quinn nodded, seeming to take her suggestion seriously. What else? Quality fabrics, not just the serviceable cottons and wools my father stocks, but silks and fine linens. The women here save for months to order such things from catalogs. Luxury items in a mining town. Quinn raised an eyebrow. Even in hardship, perhaps especially in hardship, people yearn for beauty, Lillian replied. A length of ribbon, a small bottle of perfume, these things aren't frivolous. They're reminders that life can hold more than mere survival. Something shifted in Quinn's expression, a softening around his eyes. You speak like someone who understands yearning, Miss Harlow. Lillian felt suddenly exposed, as if he could see into the depths of her disappointed hopes. Everyone yearns for something, Mr. Quinn. Indeed they do. He moved closer, his gaze never leaving her face. And what do you yearn for, Lillian Harlow? The use of her full name, spoken in his deep voice, sent a flutter through her chest. That's a rather personal question from a business associate, isn't it? Perhaps I'm overstepping, he acknowledged. But I find myself curious about the woman who was to be married yesterday, yet stands before me today discussing mercantile goods as if her heart hadn't been broken. Lillian stiffened. You're right, you are overstepping. Quinn inclined his head slightly, accepting the rebuke. My apologies. I've spent too many years in places where directness is valued over courtesy. And what places might those be? Lillian countered, turning his tactics back on him. You're something of a mystery, Mr. Quinn. You appear in Placerville with no warning, purchase a store outright, and seem to know my name before we've been introduced. People are curious. People or you, Miss Harlow? Both, she admitted. He seemed to consider how much to reveal. I was born in Boston, raised in privilege until my father lost everything in bad investments. I headed west at 17, worked cattle drives in Texas, prospected in Nevada, fought Apaches in Arizona Territory. And now you wish to be a shopkeeper in a declining mining town. Lillian couldn't keep the skepticism from her voice. I wish to put down roots, he said simply. I'm 30 years old, Miss Harlow. I've seen enough of the world to know what matters. A man needs a purpose, a place to belong, and you think you'll find that in Placerville. His gaze held her steadily. I believe I might. Something in his tone, in the intensity of his blue eyes, made Lillian's heart beat faster. She took a step back, needing distance from the strange connection she felt forming between them. Well, she said briskly, if you're serious about the store, you'll need more than books and fancy fabrics. Practical goods are still your bread and butter tools, foodstuffs, ammunition. Quinn accepted her change of subject with a slight nod. Of course. Perhaps you'd be willing to make a list of recommendations. I could do that. Lillian hesitated. Though my father might not appreciate me helping his competition. I'm not looking to compete directly with your father's store, Quinn said. I believe there's room in Placerville for both establishments, especially if they offer different merchandise. The idea was intriguing. A complementary rather than competitive approach. Exactly. Quinn's expression warmed with approval. You have a good mind for business, Miss Harlow. The compliment pleased her more than it should have. Thank you, I'll prepare that list for you. I'd be grateful. He hesitated, then added, perhaps you might join me for dinner this evening to discuss your recommendations further. The invitation took Lillian by surprise. Dining together would certainly cross the line from business to something more personal. The town would talk. I don't think that would be wise, Mr. Quinn, she said carefully. Given recent events, I should avoid giving people more to gossip about. Understanding flickered in his eyes. Of course, another time perhaps when the town has found new subjects for speculation. Perhaps, Lillian agreed, though she wasn't sure if she meant it. As she turned to leave, Quinn called after her. Miss Harlow, she paused at the door. Yes. For what it's worth, any man who would cancel a wedding by telegraph isn't worthy of your tears. Lillian didn't know how to respond to that unexpected statement. She nodded once and stepped outside, the bell jangling behind her. The encounter with Xavier Quinn left Lillian unsettled. There was something about the man that didn't quite align with his story. A cowboy turned shopkeeper. A drifter suddenly seeking roots. He spoke like an educated man, moved like someone accustomed to command, observed with the keen eyes of one who assessed threats for a living. Yet despite her misgivings, Lillian found herself spending the afternoon compiling a detailed list of merchandise recommendations for Quinn's store. She included practical items her father consistently stocked, but also noted goods that might appeal specifically to the women and children of Placerville, items often overlooked by male shopkeepers. The next morning, Lillian crossed the street once more, list in hand. The store looked different already. The windows had been washed, the porch swept clean, and a new sign hung above the door: Quinn's Mercantile and Fine Goods. Inside, she found Xavier Quinn unpacking crates that must have arrived with the morning stage. He looked up at her entrance, and the smile that crossed his face seemed genuine. "Miss Harlow, I hoped you might return." "I brought the list I promised," she said, holding out the papers. He wiped his hands on a cloth before taking them, his fingers brushing hers in the exchange. The brief contact sent a flutter through her stomach that Lillian firmly ignored. Quinn scanned the list, his eyebrows rising slightly. "Comprehensive," he remarked, "and insightful. Hair ribbons in multiple colors, not just black and white, children's books with illustrations. Sewing notions organized by purpose rather than simply dumped in a bin." He looked up at her. "You've given this considerable thought." "I've had years to think about what's lacking in Placerville's offerings," Lillian admitted. "My father believes in stocking only what has proven to sell consistently." "A sound business practice," Quinn acknowledged, "but not one that encourages growth or recognizes changing needs." He folded the list carefully and placed it in his vest pocket. "Thank you, Miss Harlow. This will be invaluable." "You're welcome." Lillian hesitated, then added, "I included some items specifically for the miners' families at the north end of town. They often can't afford to travel all the way to Denver for supplies, yet their needs are overlooked by local merchants." "Including your father, especially my father," Lillian confirmed. "He considers them poor credit risks." Quinn's expression turned thoughtful. "And are they? Some, perhaps, but most are honest folk who pay their debts even if it takes time." She met his gaze directly. "A shopkeeper who extended them fair terms and treated them with respect would earn their loyalty." "And likely the enmity of your father and the other merchants who have dismissed them," Quinn pointed out. "Yes," Lillian acknowledged. "It would be a risk." Quinn studied her for a long moment. "You're not what I expected, Lillian Harlow." "And what did you expect, Mr. Quinn?" A typical merchant's daughter, someone concerned with propriety and profit, uninterested in those at the margins. "You seem quick to form judgments of people you've just met," Lillian observed. "A necessary skill in my former life," he replied, "though I admit my judgment of you was mistaken." Before Lillian could respond, the door opened behind her, admitting her father. Thomas Harlow's expression darkened as he took in the scene, his daughter in conversation with his new competitor. "Lillian," he said, his tone sharp, "your mother needs you at home." "Papa," she began, but he cut her off. "Now, Lillian." The command was unmistakable. Lillian felt a flush of embarrassment rise to her cheeks, but she held her ground. "In a moment, Papa." "Mr. Quinn and I are discussing business." "Business," her father scoffed. "Is that what you call it?" Xavier Quinn stepped forward, his posture relaxed but his eyes alert. "Mr. Harlow, I believe we haven't been properly introduced." "Xavier Quinn," he extended his hand. Thomas Harlow ignored the offered hand. "I know who you are. The question is, what are your intentions toward my daughter?" "Papa," Lillian exclaimed, mortified. Quinn lowered his hand but maintained his composure. "At present, my intentions are purely professional. Miss Harlow has kindly provided insights into the commercial needs of Placerville." "Has she now?" Thomas glared at his daughter. "Helping the competition, Lily. Is that how you repay my years of providing for you?" "Mr. Quinn isn't looking to compete directly with your store," Lillian tried to explain. "He plans to stock different. I don't want to hear it," her father interrupted. "You're coming home. Now." Lillian looked from her father's angry face to Quinn's carefully neutral expression. Pride warred with respect for her father's authority. Finally, she nodded. "Very well, Papa. Mr. Quinn, thank you for your time. Miss Harlow." Quinn inclined his head slightly. "Mr. Harlow, I assure you my intentions toward your daughter are honorable. I value her insights and respect her intelligence." "Save your smooth talk for someone who'll believe it," Thomas retorted. "I know you're kind, Quinn, drifters who stay just long enough to cause trouble before moving on." "You're mistaken," Quinn said evenly. "I intend to remain in Placerville." "We'll see about that." With a final glare, Thomas took his daughter's arm and steered her toward the door. Once outside, Lillian pulled free of her father's grasp. "That was unnecessary and embarrassing, Papa." "What's embarrassing is finding my daughter alone with a man of questionable character barely a day after being jilted by her fiancé," he shot back. "Do you have any idea what people will say?" "I don't care what they say," Lillian insisted. "Mr. Quinn asked for my help with his business and I gave it. There's nothing improper about that." "Nothing improper," her father's voice rose. "The whole town is already whispering about how quickly you've transferred your affections from Jonathan to this Quinn fellow." The accusation stung. "That's absurd. I barely know Mr. Quinn, which makes your behavior all the more questionable." Thomas lowered his voice as they approached their house. "Lily, I'm trying to protect you. That man is dangerous. Dangerous." Lillian couldn't keep the skepticism from her voice. "He's a shopkeeper, Papa. No man with hands like his has spent his life stocking shelves," her father insisted. "He's been in fights, serious ones. You can see it in the way he moves, the way he watches everything. Men like that bring trouble." Lillian couldn't entirely dismiss her father's concerns. She'd had similar thoughts herself about Quinn's background. Still, his high-handedness rankled. "I'm 22 years old, Papa. I'm capable of judging a man's character for myself." "Are you?" Thomas's expression softened slightly. "Your judgment led you to accept Jonathan Prescott's proposal. How did that turn out?" The reminder of her failed engagement cut deep. Lillian fell silent as they entered the house, her mother looking up anxiously from her mending. "What's happened?" Margaret asked, noting their expressions. "I found our daughter consorting with that new shopkeeper, Quinn," Thomas reported grimly. "Alone in his store discussing business." The quotation marks were audible in his tone. "Lillian," her mother gasped, "after everything that's happened, how could you be so careless with your reputation?" "There was nothing inappropriate about our conversation," Lillian defended. "Mr. Quinn asked for my advice on what merchandise to stock, and I provided it. And I suppose his interest is purely professional." Margaret's skepticism matched her husband's. "I don't know what his interest is," Lillian admitted, "but he's treated me with nothing but respect." "For now," her father muttered. Lillian felt suddenly exhausted by their concern, their constant worry about appearances and reputations. "I'm going to my room. I have a headache." Neither parent tried to stop her as she retreated upstairs. In the privacy of her bedroom, Lillian sat by the window, her thoughts in turmoil. Had she been foolish to help Xavier Quinn? Was she so desperate for attention after Jonathan's rejection that she'd transferred her interest to the first handsome stranger who showed her kindness? No, she decided. Whatever her feelings toward Quinn might be, and she wasn't entirely sure of them herself, her assistance had been given out of genuine interest in improving Placerville's commercial offerings. If her father couldn't see that, it was his limitation, not hers. A movement across the street caught her eye. Xavier Quinn had emerged from his store and stood on the boardwalk, gazing toward the Harlow house. For a moment, Lillian thought he might be looking for her. But then he turned and walked purposefully toward the north end of town, toward the miners' settlement her father had dismissed as unprofitable. Curious, Lillian watched until his tall figure disappeared from view. What business did Xavier Quinn have with the miners' families? Was he taking her suggestion to heart, or did he have other motives for visiting that part of town? The questions lingered in her mind as the day wore on. By evening, rumors had begun to circulate that Quinn had been seen talking with the foreman at the largest remaining mine, offering credit terms to workers who'd been blacklisted by other merchants in town. "It's commercial suicide," Thomas Harlow declared over dinner. "Those miners haven't been paid in 3 months. The company's on the verge of bankruptcy." "Perhaps Mr. Quinn knows something we don't," Lillian suggested mildly. Her father snorted. What he knows is how to curry favor with desperate men. He's playing a dangerous game. Or perhaps he simply believes people deserve a chance, Lillian countered. Not everyone measures worth solely by the contents of a man's wallet. That kind of thinking leads to empty shelves and unpaid suppliers, her father warned. Mark my words, within 6 months, Quinn's store will be closed and he'll have moved on to his next scheme. Lillian said nothing more, but privately she wondered if her father might be right. Was Xavier Quinn's generosity genuine, or was it a calculated move to establish himself quickly in the community? And why did she care so much about the answer? The next week brought changes to Placerville. Quinn's store received multiple shipments of goods, and by week's end, his shelves were fully stocked not just with the practical items Lillian had suggested, but with an array of goods that had previously required a journey to Denver to obtain. Word spread quickly, and customers, particularly women, began to frequent the new establishment. They returned with tales of fair prices, quality merchandise, and a proprietor who remembered names and preferences with uncanny accuracy. Most surprising to Lillian were the reports that miners' wives from the North Settlement had been seen shopping at Quinn's, carrying purchases wrapped in brown paper and string. Somehow, he'd arranged credit for families her father had refused to serve. The situation created tension in the Harlow household. Business at their store declined noticeably as curious townspeople visited the competition. Thomas Harlow's mood darkened with each passing day. He can't sustain these prices, he insisted. He's selling at barely above cost. Perhaps his suppliers offer better terms, Lillian suggested. No supplier is that generous, her father countered. He's using capital to undercut established businesses. Once we're weakened, he'll raise prices to recoup his investment. The theory seemed overly cynical to Lillian, but she knew better than to argue further. Instead, she watched from a distance as Xavier Quinn integrated himself into Placerville's daily life. He attended church each Sunday, sitting quietly at the back. He joined the men's discussion group at the town hall, offering measured opinions on matters from mining regulations to road improvements. He contributed generously to the school fund and volunteered to help repair the church roof after a particularly violent storm. Most notably, he never approached Lillian directly. After their confrontation with her father, Quinn maintained a respectful distance, greeting her politely when they crossed paths but initiating no further conversation. Lillian told herself she was relieved by his restraint, but a small, honest part of her acknowledged disappointment. June turned to July, bringing scorching heat to the high country. Placerville prepared for its annual Independence Day celebration, a modest affair compared to larger towns, but enthusiastically attended nonetheless. There would be a picnic, games for the children, speeches from local dignitaries, and in the evening, dancing on a wooden platform erected in the town square. In previous years, Lillian had looked forward to the festivities. This year, she approached the holiday with mixed emotions. Jonathan had been meant to accompany her. They'd planned to announce their wedding date to the assembled townspeople. Now, she would attend alone, subject to pitying glances and whispered comments. "You should wear the blue silk," her mother advised as they discussed the celebration. "It brings out your eyes." "The blue silk is too formal for a picnic, Mama," Lillian replied. "Besides, I'm not trying to impress anyone." Margaret Harlow gave her daughter a knowing look. "Not even Mr. Quinn?" Lillian felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Certainly not. Mr. Quinn has shown no particular interest in me since Papa's intervention." "Perhaps not openly," her mother conceded, "but I've seen how he watches you in church. The man is interested, Lily. The question is, are you interested in him?" The directness of the question caught Lillian off guard. I hardly know him, Mama." "That's not an answer," Margaret observed. "Your father worries, you know. He fears you might be vulnerable after Jonathan's betrayal, susceptible to attention from a handsome stranger." "I'm not a foolish girl to be swayed by a handsome face," Lillian protested. "No, you're not," her mother agreed. "But you are human, dear, and Mr. Quinn is undeniably attractive not just in appearance but in his manner. He listens when women speak, something rare enough to be noteworthy. Lillian couldn't argue with that assessment. Even if I were interested, which I'm not saying I am, Papa would never approve. Your father's opinion of Mr. Quinn might improve if the man proved himself trustworthy, Margaret suggested. Time often reveals true character. The conversation left Lillian thoughtful. Was she interested in Xavier Quinn? The question required more self-examination than she was comfortable with. Certainly, she found him intriguing, but she'd been intrigued by Jonathan Prescott too, and that had ended in humiliation. Better to guard her heart than risk further pain. Independence Day dawned bright and clear. The town square had been decorated with bunting and flags, tables set up beneath canvas awnings to protect the food from the sun. By mid-morning, most of Placerville's residents had gathered, dressed in their Sunday best despite the heat. Lillian arrived with her parents, wearing a simple white dress with red ribbon trim, patriotic without being showy. She carried a basket containing her mother's famous apple pie, their contribution to the communal feast. As they approached the square, Lillian's step faltered. Xavier Quinn stood near the speaker's platform, engaged in conversation with Reverend Miller and Judge Hopkins. He wore a crisp white shirt, dark vest, and trousers, his usual hat absent to reveal thick dark hair shot through with silver at the temples. He looked every inch the respectable businessman, not the dangerous drifter her father had described. As if sensing her gaze, Quinn looked up. Their eyes met across the crowded square, and for a moment, everything else seemed to fade into the background. Then someone called Lillian's name, breaking the connection. "Lillian, over here," Mrs. Whittaker waved from a nearby table. "Come help us arrange the food." With a nod to Quinn that she hoped appeared casual, Lillian moved to assist the older women with their preparations. For the next hour, she kept herself busy, serving food, refilling lemonade pitchers, and making polite conversation with neighbors who carefully avoided mentioning her canceled wedding. The formal part of the celebration began at noon, with speeches from the mayor, the judge, and other prominent citizens. To Lillian's surprise, Xavier Quinn was invited to address the gathering as well. He spoke briefly but eloquently about the promise of the West, the value of community, and his gratitude for Placerville's welcome. "This town stands at a crossroads," he concluded. "The easy silver may be gone, but with determination and cooperation, Placerville can thrive. I've cast my lot with you, and I believe my faith will be rewarded." The speech was met with enthusiastic applause, particularly from the miners and their families who'd been extended credit at Quinn's store. Lillian found herself clapping as well, impressed by his sincerity and vision. As the afternoon progressed, children's races gave way to horseshoe competitions for the men and quilting displays for the women. Lillian participated where expected, but found herself increasingly distracted, her attention drawn repeatedly to Xavier Quinn. He moved through the celebration with ease, conversing with miners and bankers alike, playing games with children, complimenting the ladies on their cooking. Yet there remained something slightly apart about him, as if he were observing rather than fully participating. As evening approached, musicians began tuning their instruments on the dance platform. Lanterns were lit, casting a warm glow over the square as darkness fell. Couples formed for the first dance, a lively Virginia reel that set feet tapping and skirts swirling. Lillian sat with her mother at the edge of the gathering, watching. In previous years, she'd never lacked for dance partners, but tonight, the young men of Placerville seemed hesitant to approach her. Whether out of respect for her recent disappointment or fear of becoming the subject of gossip themselves, they kept their distance. "Don't let them make you a wallflower," Margaret murmured. "Hold your head high, Lily." "I'm not interested in dancing anyway," Lillian replied, though the music made her feet itch to move. "Miss Harlow." The deep voice startled her. Xavier Quinn stood before them, hat in hand. "Mrs. Harlow," he added, nodding respectfully to Lillian's mother, "I hope I find you both well." "Quite well, Mr. Quinn," Margaret answered when Lillian remained silent. "A lovely celebration, isn't it? Indeed, though it seems incomplete when some are excluded from the festivities." His gaze rested meaningfully on Lillian. I'm not excluded, she protested. I'm simply resting. Then perhaps you're sufficiently rested for a dance. He extended his hand. Lillian hesitated, acutely aware of the eyes that had turned in their direction. Accepting Quinn's invitation would set tongues wagging anew, refusing would look like fear. Go on, Lily, her mother encouraged softly. One dance won't compromise your reputation. Drawing a deep breath, Lillian placed her hand in Quinn's. One dance, Mr. Quinn. His fingers closed firmly around hers as he led her toward the platform. The musicians were just beginning a waltz, a dance that required closer proximity than the reels and square dances that had preceded it. Quinn's hand settled at her waist, maintaining a proper distance between them as they joined the other couples. His touch was light but secure as he guided her into the first steps of the dance. You move well, he observed after a moment. Did you learn in Placerville? In Boston, actually, Lillian replied, before we came west. My mother insisted on dancing lessons for all proper young ladies. Boston, Quinn repeated. We have that in common, then. So it would seem, though I suspect our experiences of the city were quite different. A smile touched his lips. Undoubtedly. The Boston of Beacon Hill differs greatly from the Boston of the waterfront. Is that where you lived? Near the waterfront, until I was 12, he confirmed. Then my father's investments paid off and we moved to a brownstone on Commonwealth Avenue. The grandeur didn't last, of course. The admission of reduced circumstances seemed surprisingly candid. You speak of it easily, Lillian noted. Time provides perspective, Quinn replied. What seemed like ruin then ultimately set me on a path I wouldn't trade. His hand tightened slightly at her waist as he guided her through a turn. And you, do you regret leaving Boston? Lillian considered the question. Sometimes, she admitted. I miss the libraries, the concerts, the sense that the world was larger than a single street. She glanced around at the modest celebration. But there's a closeness here that Boston lacked. For better or worse, people know one another. For better and worse, Quinn amended. His blue eyes studied her face. They've been unkind to you, I think, since your wedding was canceled. The direct reference to her humiliation caught Lillian off guard. They mean well mostly, she defended. They simply don't know what to say, so they say nothing. Or worse, whisper behind your back, Quinn shook his head. That's not kindness, Miss Harlow, that's cowardice. His bluntness was startling but somehow refreshing. Perhaps, Lillian acknowledged, but what would you have them say? Sorry you were abandoned by the man you loved. Better luck next time, they might say. His loss was greater than yours, Quinn suggested quietly, for it surely was. The compliment, delivered with such apparent sincerity, sent warmth spreading through Lillian's chest. She looked away, uncertain how to respond. I've embarrassed you, Quinn observed. That wasn't my intention. Not embarrassed, Lillian corrected, just unaccustomed to such directness. Another failing of small towns, he noted, too much talking around truths instead of facing them squarely. The music began to wind down and Quinn slowed their steps. For instance, the truth that I've wanted to speak with you again since the day your father interrupted our conversation. Lillian's heart beat faster. Mr. Quinn, Xavier, he corrected. My friends call me Xavier. Are we friends, then? Lillian asked. I'd like us to be. The music ended, but he didn't immediately release her. Would you walk with me, Lillian, just to the edge of the square where we might speak without every eye in Placerville upon us? Lillian knew she should refuse. A private conversation with Quinn would certainly be noted and commented upon. Yet something in his expression and earnestness, a vulnerability beneath the confident exterior, made her nod. Just for a moment, she agreed. They moved away from the dance platform toward the shadow of the large oak that marked the corner of the square. The music resumed behind them, another waltz drawing couples back to the floor. I owe you an apology, Quinn began once they were beyond easy earshot of the celebration. I should have spoken to your father before approaching you that first day. In my eagerness to establish myself here, I disregarded proprieties. The apology surprised Lillian. You needn't apologize for treating me as a person with thoughts worth hearing, she said. That's all too rare in Placerville. Still, I exposed you to gossip and your father's displeasure. Quinn's expression turned serious. That was never my intention. Why did you approach me? Lillian asked the question that had lingered in her mind for weeks. Of all the people in Placerville who might have advised you on your business, why choose the daughter of your competitor? Quinn seemed to weigh his words carefully before responding. Because when I saw you that first day, crying as the church bells rang, something in me responded to your pain. I know what it is to have dreams shattered, plans upended. I needed to speak with you. The confession, so simply stated, took Lillian's breath away. You felt sorry for me, she said, a note of disappointment entering her voice. No, Quinn corrected firmly. I recognized something in you, a strength beneath the hurt, a dignity that refused to be diminished by circumstance. His gaze held her steadily. You intrigued me, Lillian Harlow, you still do. The honesty of his words disarmed her. I don't know how to respond to that, she admitted. You needn't respond at all, he assured her. I only wanted you to understand that my interest isn't a passing fancy or a business strategy. Before Lillian could formulate a reply, a shout from the direction of the square caught their attention. Men's voices raised in anger, followed by the sound of breaking glass. Quinn tensed beside her, his posture suddenly alert. Stay here, he instructed, already moving back toward the commotion. Lillian ignored the directive, following close behind. As they rounded the oak tree, the scene in the square came into view. A group of miners, clearly intoxicated, had surrounded her father near one of the refreshment tables. Thomas Harlow stood rigid, face flushed with anger as one of the larger men jabbed a finger into his chest. Refused us credit when our children were hungry, the miner was saying, his voice slurred but loud enough to carry. High and mighty Harlow, too good for the likes of us, but quick enough to raise prices when the mine cut wages. I run a business, not a charity, Thomas retorted. Take your complaints elsewhere, Simmons. You're disrupting the celebration. The miner Simmons grabbed a pitcher of lemonade and hurled it to the ground, where it shattered at Thomas's feet. Your celebration, maybe, not ours. Several townspeople moved to intervene, but the miners closed ranks, creating a tense standoff. Lillian hurried forward, fear for her father overriding caution. Papa, she called. At the sound of her voice, Thomas looked up, his expression shifting from anger to alarm. Stay back, Lillian. But it was too late. Her presence had been noted by the miners, one of whom turned with an unpleasant grin. Well, if it ain't the jilted bride herself, he drawled. Guess even a fancy letter writer from Denver could see Harlow blood ain't worth having. The crude taunt cut deep. Lillian faltered, humiliation washing over her anew. That's enough. Xavier Quinn's voice, calm but carrying unmistakable authority, cut through the tension. He stepped between Lillian and the miners, his stance relaxed but ready. You've made your point, gentlemen. Now it's time to move on. Simmons squinted at Quinn. This ain't your business, shopkeeper. You've made it my business, Quinn countered evenly. These people are my neighbors and customers, so are you. I'd rather not see either side do something they'll regret come morning. A murmur passed through the group of miners. Clearly, Quinn had earned some measure of respect among them through his extension of credit. He ain't worth the trouble anyway, another miner muttered, tugging at Simmons's arm. Come on, let's get back to the camp. For a moment, it seemed Simmons might resist, his bloodshot eyes fixed on Thomas Harlow with undisguised hostility. Then, with a muttered curse, he allowed himself to be led away. The rest of the miners followed, the crowd parting to let them pass. As they retreated, conversation gradually resumed in the square, though the festive mood had dimmed considerably. Thomas Harlow stood rigid, glaring at Quinn. I didn't need your interference, he said stiffly. Of course not, Quinn agreed easily. But your daughter didn't need to witness a brawl either. Thomas glanced at Lillian, something like shame crossing his features. No, he conceded. She didn't. He hesitated, then added grudgingly, Thank you for intervening. Quinn inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement. Those men have legitimate grievances, Mr. Harlow. The mine owners have been withholding wages while continuing to charge exorbitant prices at the company store. It breeds resentment. That doesn't justify threatening behavior, Thomas insisted. No, but it explains it. Quinn's tone remained mild. Understanding the cause might help prevent future confrontations. Lillian watched the exchange with growing respect for Quinn's diplomacy. He hadn't backed down from her father, but neither had he escalated the tension. Thomas seemed to struggle with his response. Finally, he sighed. "Perhaps you're right." He glanced toward the retreating miners. "I may have been inflexible in my dealings with them." The admission, coming from her proudly stubborn father, astonished Lillian. She caught Quinn's eye and found a hint of satisfaction in his expression. "It's not too late to mend fences," Quinn suggested. "Fair terms, clear agreements, most men respond well to being treated with respect." Thomas nodded slowly. "I'll consider it." He looked at his daughter, noting her proximity to Quinn with a frown that lacked its usual heat. "Lillian, your mother was asking for you. We should be heading home soon." The implied dismissal was clear but less harsh than Lillian had feared. "Yes, Papa, I'll find her." As her father moved away, Lillian turned to Quinn. "Thank you," she said softly. "That could have ended very differently." "Your father's a proud man," Quinn observed, "but not a foolish one. He'll think about what happened tonight." "Thanks to you." Lillian studied his face in the lantern light. "You have an unusual way with people, Xavier Quinn. You seem to know exactly what to say to diffuse tension." A shadow crossed his features. "A skill born of necessity," he said cryptically, "not always used for peaceful purposes in my past." The admission hinted at darker experiences than he'd previously acknowledged. "Your past seems full of mysteries," Lillian noted. "Parts of it are better left in the past," Quinn agreed, "but if you're curious, I'm willing to share what I can." He glanced toward where her father had disappeared into the crowd, "Though perhaps not tonight." "No," Lillian agreed reluctantly, "not tonight." She took a step back. "I should find my mother," Quinn nodded. "Of course." He hesitated, then added, "Lillian, might I call on you properly? With your father's permission." The request, so formal and traditional, brought a smile to her lips. "You want to court me, Mr. Quinn?" "I want the opportunity to know you better," he replied seriously, "without skulking in shadows or causing gossip." The prospect both thrilled and frightened her. "You should know I'm not ready for anything more than friendship," she warned. "Jonathan's betrayal is still too fresh." "I understand," Quinn assured her. "Friendship is a good beginning." Lillian considered for a moment, then nodded. "Very well, you may speak with my father." "Thank you." The smile that transformed his features made him look younger, less guarded. "I'll call tomorrow afternoon if that's acceptable." "It is." Lillian offered her hand, which he took briefly. "Good night, Xavier." "Good night, Lillian." As she walked away, Lillian felt lighter than she had in weeks. The evening had brought unexpected developments: her father's grudging respect for Quinn, Quinn's request to court her, her own willingness to consider it. Perhaps Reverend Miller had been right after all. One door had closed, but another was opening before her. The following afternoon found Lillian unusually anxious, alternating between the window and her mirror as the appointed hour for Quinn's visit approached. She'd chosen a blue dress, not the silk her mother had suggested for the celebration, but a simpler cotton that nonetheless complemented her coloring. Her father had been surprisingly receptive when she'd mentioned Quinn's intention to call. The incident at the celebration seemed to have softened his stance somewhat, though he remained cautious. "I'll hear what he has to say," Thomas had conceded at breakfast. "But don't pin your hopes on this, Lily. We still know very little about the man." At precisely 3 o'clock, Xavier Quinn appeared at their door, hat in hand and jacket brushed clean of dust. From her position at the top of the stairs, Lillian heard her father greet him and usher him into the parlor. The door closed, muffling their voices. The conversation continued for nearly half an hour before her father emerged, expression thoughtful but not angry. "Lillian," he called up the stairs. "Mr. Quinn would like to speak with you now." Heart hammering, Lillian descended the stairs, conscious of her father's evaluating gaze. "You may use the parlor," he said. "The door will remain open." "Thank you, Papa," Lillian murmured as she passed him. Xavier Quinn stood as she entered the room, his usual composure slightly disrupted by what appeared to be nervousness. The realization that he wasn't entirely confident made Lillian feel more at ease. "Miss Harlow," he greeted her, "thank you for receiving me, Mr. Quinn." She took a seat on the settee, gesturing for him to resume his place in the armchair across from her. I trust your conversation with my father was productive. A smile touched his lips. He didn't order me from the premises, if that's what you're asking. I consider that progress. Indeed. Lillian returned his smile. What did you discuss, if I may ask? Your father had questions about my background, my intentions in Placerville, and my plans for the future. Quinn's expression turned more serious. I answered as honestly as I could, though some parts of my history are complicated. Did he find your answers satisfactory? Sufficient to permit me to speak with you, Quinn replied, though he reserved judgment on whether I might continue to do so. The conditional approval was more than Lillian had expected, given her father's previous hostility. And what did you tell him about your intentions toward me? Quinn met her gaze directly. I told him that I find you intelligent, principled, and beautiful, that I wish to know you better with no presumptions or demands, that I understand you've recently suffered a disappointment and require time to heal. The candor of his response left Lillian momentarily speechless. That's very straightforward, she managed finally. I've found honesty serves better than manipulation in business and in personal matters, Quinn said simply, even when the truth might not be what the other person wants to hear. Especially then. His blue eyes held her steadily. Deception might provide temporary advantage, but it inevitably creates greater harm in the end. Lillian thought of Jonathan's letters, full of promises he'd never intended to keep. Yes, she agreed softly. It does. A comfortable silence fell between them, neither rushing to fill it. Finally, Quinn leaned forward slightly. I'd like to invite you to dinner on Saturday evening, he said. At the hotel dining room, where we might converse without causing undue speculation. Your parents would be welcome to join us, of course. The invitation was perfectly proper, yet it made Lillian's pulse quicken. I'd like that, she said, though I think my parents might allow us to dine without their direct supervision. The hotel is public enough to satisfy propriety. Then Saturday at 7, Quinn confirmed. Saturday at 7, Lillian agreed. The days until Saturday passed with surprising speed. Lillian found herself anticipating the dinner with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. It would be her first public appearance with Quinn, an acknowledgement that their relationship had progressed beyond mere business acquaintances. The town would talk, certainly, but Lillian discovered she minded less than she might have a month earlier. Jonathan's abandonment had freed her, in a way, from concern about others' opinions. Once the worst had happened, public humiliation on what should have been her wedding day, other judgments seemed less significant. Saturday evening arrived clear and pleasantly warm, the summer heat moderated by a gentle breeze from the mountains. Lillian wore her best dress, a dove-gray silk with navy trim that her mother had ordered from Denver the previous Christmas. She arranged her auburn hair in a simple but elegant style, securing it with pearl-headed pins that had belonged to her grandmother. You look lovely, Margaret Harlow said as Lillian descended the stairs. Mr. Quinn won't be able to take his eyes off you. Mama, Lillian protested, though the compliment pleased her. Her father looked up from his newspaper, his expression a mixture of pride and concern. Remember what we discussed, Lily. Home by 10 o'clock, and if he says or does anything improper, I know, Papa, Lillian interrupted gently. But he won't. Thomas harumphed noncommittally. We'll see. A knock at the door signaled Quinn's arrival. Thomas rose to answer it, subjecting the younger man to a final evaluating look before stepping aside to admit him. Xavier Quinn entered, his usual working clothes replaced by a well-tailored dark suit that emphasized his broad shoulders and trim waist. His hair had been freshly cut, revealing a small scar at his temple that Lillian hadn't noticed before. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. Harlow, he greeted them before his gaze found Lillian. Something flickered in his eyes, appreciation mingled with something deeper that made her heart skip. Miss Harlow, you look beautiful. Thank you, Lillian managed, suddenly aware of her parents watching the exchange closely. You look quite handsome yourself, Mr. Quinn. The hotel is expecting us, Quinn said after a moment. The dining room can be busy on Saturday evenings. Thomas Harlow cleared his throat. 10 o'clock, Quinn, not a minute later. Yes, sir, Quinn agreed solemnly. You have my word. The walk to the hotel took only a few minutes, the evening air fragrant with pine and late-blooming wildflowers. Quinn offered his arm, which Lillian accepted after a momentary hesitation. "You do look beautiful," he said quietly as they walked. "Though I suspect you'd look equally lovely in sackcloth." The compliment brought color to Lillian's cheeks. "I doubt that very much." "I don't," Quinn countered. "True beauty emanates from within. The outer trappings merely enhance what's already there." "You have a silver tongue, Mr. Quinn," Lillian observed. "Has it always served you so well?" A chuckle escaped him, low and warm. "Not always, no. There was a time when I relied more on my fists than my words. It was a hard lesson, learning that violence solves little." "How did you learn it?" Lillian asked, curious about this glimpse into his past. Quinn's expression sobered. "The hard way, through loss and regret." Something in his tone dissuaded Lillian from pressing further, at least for the moment. They had reached the hotel, a 3-story structure that was Placerville's tallest building and primary accommodation for travelers. The dining room was indeed busy, but Quinn had reserved a table near the window, slightly apart from the main seating area. Heads turned as they entered, conversations pausing briefly before resuming with increased animation. Lillian recognized several of the town's more prominent families among the diners, including the mayor and his wife, who offered polite nods of acknowledgement. Once seated, Quinn ordered wine, a luxury rarely available in Placerville, and suggested the roast beef, which he assured Lillian was excellent. "You dine here often?" she asked. "I take most of my meals here," he confirmed. "The rooms above my store are adequate for sleeping, but they lack cooking facilities. Mrs. Beaumont, the hotel's cook, takes pity on me." "You live above your store." Lillian hadn't considered Quinn's living arrangements before. For now, he smiled slightly. "It's convenient for a bachelor, though hardly ideal for the long term." The implication that he anticipated a change in circumstances at some point sent a flutter through Lillian's stomach. She directed the conversation to safer topics: the weather, the town's preparations for the upcoming harvest festival, the books they'd both enjoyed. To her surprise, Quinn was well-read, familiar not only with practical texts but with poetry and philosophy as well. "My mother's influence," he explained when Lillian expressed surprise at his knowledge of Wordsworth. "She believed education was the key to a better life, even after my father's financial collapse." "She sounds like a remarkable woman," Lillian observed. "She was," Quinn agreed, a shadow crossing his features. "She passed away when I was 19, just before I headed west." "I'm sorry," Lillian said, recognizing the grief that still lingered in his expression. "You must miss her." "Every day," he acknowledged. "But I find comfort in knowing she'd approve of the man I've become, eventually." "Eventually," Quinn's mouth twisted in a rueful smile. "I traveled some dark roads before finding my way, Lillian. My mother would have been disappointed by some of my choices. But not now. I hope not now." He met her gaze directly. "I've tried to live honorably, to make amends for past mistakes. Opening the store in Placerville is part of that." The admission intrigued her. "How so?" Quinn seemed to consider how much to reveal. "I came to Colorado originally as a young man, full of anger and ambition. I worked the mines until they nearly killed me, then turned to less reputable activities." He took a sip of wine before continuing. "I rode with some rough men, did things I'm not proud of. But I was given a second chance, and I promised myself I'd use it well." The vague reference to a troubled past might have alarmed Lillian weeks earlier, but now she found herself more curious than concerned. "And your second chance brought you to Placerville?" "In a roundabout way, yes." Quinn leaned forward slightly. "I want to build something here, Lillian, something lasting and worthwhile. The store is just the beginning." "What else do you envision?" Lillian asked, caught by the intensity of his expression. "A community that thrives even as the mines fade." "Placerville has good water, fertile land in the valley, access to timber. With the right investments and leadership, it could transition from mining to more sustainable enterprises." The vision he outlined was compelling: a school expanded to include higher education, a library, perhaps even a small hospital. businesses that served the region's farmers and ranchers rather than relying solely on the diminishing returns from the mines. "You've given this considerable thought," Lillian noted, impressed by the scope of his plans. "I have," Quinn acknowledged. "But I can't accomplish it alone. I'll need partners, allies who share the vision." His gaze held hers. "People like you, Lillian." The statement caught her off guard. "Me? I'm just a merchant's daughter." "You're far more than that," Quinn countered firmly. "You're intelligent, observant, connected to this community in ways I'm not. Your suggestions for my store demonstrated insight and empathy. Those qualities are rare and valuable." His sincere belief in her capabilities warmed something inside Lillian that had grown cold after Jonathan's rejection. Jonathan had praised her appearance, her manners, her suitable background, never her mind or her character. "Thank you," she said softly, "for seeing more in me than most do." "I see you, Lillian Harlow," Quinn replied simply. "That's all." The remainder of dinner passed pleasantly, their conversation flowing easily from serious topics to lighter ones. Quinn proved to have a dry wit that frequently drew genuine laughter from Lillian, a sound she realized had been absent from her life for too long. As the evening drew to a close, they walked slowly back toward the Harlow home, neither seeming eager for the night to end. "May I ask you something personal?" Lillian ventured as they approached her street. "You may ask," Quinn replied. "I'll answer if I can." "The scar on your temple, how did you get it?" Quinn's hand rose unconsciously to the mark. "A disagreement that turned violent," he said after a moment. "During my less reputable days, were you a gunfighter?" Lillian asked directly. The question hung between them for several heartbeats. "Not exactly," Quinn finally answered, "but I've used guns, yes, and I was good at it." His expression turned grim, too good for a time. The admission should have frightened her, but somehow it didn't. Perhaps because Quinn spoke of his past with such evident regret, or perhaps because the man who walked beside her, now thoughtful, gentle despite his strength, seemed far removed from the angry young man he described. "Thank you for your honesty," she said simply. They had reached her home, the lamps in the front parlor visible through the curtains. Her parents were waiting, no doubt watching the clock. "Thank you for a lovely evening," Quinn said, stopping at the foot of the porch steps. "I'd like to see you again if you're willing." "I am," Lillian replied without hesitation. A smile transformed his features, warming his blue eyes. "Perhaps a picnic next Sunday after church. The weather should be fine." "I'd like that very much." Quinn took her hand, his touch warm through her glove. "Good night, Lillian." He raised her fingers to his lips, pressing a brief, proper kiss to her knuckles. "Until Sunday." The simple gesture sent a thrill through Lillian that no embrace from Jonathan had ever evoked. "Good night, Xavier." She watched him walk away, his tall figure disappearing into the darkness, before turning to face her waiting parents and what would undoubtedly be a thorough interrogation about the evening's events. Sunday's picnic led to a walk by the creek the following Wednesday, which led to an invitation to Sunday dinner at the Harlow home the week after. July turned to August, and Xavier Quinn became a regular visitor, his presence gradually accepted, if not entirely welcomed, by Thomas Harlow. Placerville noticed, of course. Whispers followed Lillian and Xavier whenever they appeared together, but the tone had shifted from malicious speculation to something more akin to cautious approval. The jilted bride had found new happiness, and with a man who was proving himself an asset to the community. For Quinn had not been idle during the weeks of their courtship. True to his word, he had begun implementing his vision for Placerville's future, investing in improvements to the town's infrastructure, offering fair terms to the miners and their families, and proposing a cooperative arrangement with Thomas Harlow that would allow both stores to thrive by specializing in different merchandise. Initially skeptical, Thomas had gradually come to respect Quinn's business acumen and apparent sincerity. The final barrier fell when Quinn, accompanied by Lillian, rode to the North Settlement during a particularly violent storm to deliver medicine to a miner's child suffering from pneumonia. The journey had been dangerous, the mountain roads turned to mud by the deluge, but Quinn had insisted on going himself rather than sending a messenger. "He's a good man," Thomas acknowledged grudgingly upon their safe return. Better than I gave him credit for. As August neared its end, Quinn invited Lillian for a special dinner at the hotel. To celebrate, he explained when she inquired about the occasion. Celebrate what, you'll see, he replied with an enigmatic smile. The evening began like many they'd shared, with easy conversation over excellent food. But Lillian sensed an underlying tension in Quinn, a nervous energy he couldn't quite conceal. Is something wrong? She finally asked as they lingered over dessert. Not wrong, no. Quinn set down his fork and reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small velvet box. But something important, something I hope will change both our lives. Lillian's breath caught as he opened the box to reveal a ring, a delicate gold band set with a modest but perfect diamond. Lillian Harlow, Quinn began, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes, these past months have been the happiest of my life. You've brought light to places that were dark for too long, hope where I'd forgotten it could exist. He took her hand gently. I love you. Will you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? Though she had begun to suspect his feelings ran deep, the declaration still caught Lillian by surprise. In the aftermath of Jonathan's betrayal, she had guarded her heart carefully, allowing affection but restraining deeper emotions. Yet in this moment, looking into Xavier Quinn's earnest blue eyes, Lillian recognized the truth she'd been avoiding. She loved him too. Not with the girlish infatuation she'd felt for Jonathan, but with a woman's understanding of what true partnership might mean. I need to tell you something first, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Concern flickered across Quinn's features. Anything? I was grateful when you first spoke to me, Lillian admitted. Grateful for the distraction from my humiliation, grateful for your kindness when others offered only pity. She drew a steadying breath. I feared sometimes that my feelings for you might be born of that gratitude rather than something deeper. And now? Quinn asked, his expression carefully neutral. Now I know better. Lillian squeezed his hand. What I feel for you isn't gratitude, Xavier. It's love, solid and real and sometimes frightening in its intensity. I do want to marry you. The tension drained from Quinn's shoulders, relief and joy transforming his features. You're certain? I know it's been a short time since I'm certain, Lillian interrupted. More certain than I've ever been about anything. Quinn slipped the ring onto her finger where it sat as if it had always belonged there. It was my mother's, he explained, the one thing I kept when everything else was sold to pay my father's debts. The significance of the gift brought tears to Lillian's eyes. It's beautiful, she whispered. I'll treasure it always. Quinn raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her fingers just above the ring. When? He asked simply. When will you marry me? The question brought an unexpected smile to Lillian's face. Soon, she decided. Very soon. Word of their engagement spread quickly through Placerville. Most received the news with genuine pleasure, though a few expressed concern about the relatively brief courtship. Are you certain, Lily? Her mother asked privately. It's only been 3 months since Jonathan. I'm certain, Mama, Lillian assured her. What I felt for Jonathan was based on words on paper, dreams, and imagination. What I feel for Xavier is real, tested by time spent together, by seeing his actions as well as hearing his promises. Margaret studied her daughter's face, then nodded slowly. Yes, I believe you are certain. There's a steadiness about you now that was missing before. She smiled, a hint of mischief in her eyes. Besides, the way that man looks at you as if you hung the moon and stars is rather convincing evidence of his devotion. Preparations for the wedding proceeded swiftly. Unlike the elaborate affair planned for her marriage to Jonathan, Lillian wanted a simple ceremony with only close friends and family in attendance. The date was set for the 3rd Sunday in September, when the aspen trees would be turning gold in the mountains above Placerville. As the day approached, Lillian found herself growing increasingly nervous, though not about her decision to marry Xavier. Rather, she worried that something might prevent their union, that fate or circumstance might once again leave her standing alone while the church bells rang. You're being foolish, she told her reflection as she prepared for bed the night before the wedding. Xavier isn't Jonathan. He won't abandon you. Yet the fear persisted, a whisper of doubt that followed her into restless sleep. She dreamed of waiting at the church, the bells tolling while the congregation murmured in growing discomfort. In the dream, the doors remained closed, no bridegroom appearing to claim her. Lillian woke with a start, heart racing. Dawn was just breaking, pale light filtering through her bedroom window. Seeking reassurance, she moved to the window and looked toward Quinn's store. A light already burned within, evidence that he was awake and preparing for their wedding day. The sight calmed her, dispelling the lingering unease from her dream. Xavier was here, steady and reliable as the mountains themselves. The morning passed in a flurry of activity. Margaret Harlow fussed over her daughter's appearance, arranging and rearranging her hair until Lillian gently reminded her that they would be late if she continued. "I just want everything to be perfect for you," her mother said, blinking back tears. "After everything you've been through." "It will be perfect, Mama," Lillian assured her, "because this time I'm marrying the right man." They traveled to the church in a carriage borrowed from Judge Hopkins, its sides decorated with ribbons and late summer flowers. As they approached, Lillian saw that a small crowd had gathered outside, larger than the intimate group she'd invited. "Word spread," her father explained with a rueful smile. "Half the town wants to witness Xavier Quinn's wedding to the girl he rode into town to claim." The phrasing struck Lillian as odd. "He didn't ride into town to claim me, Papa. We met after he arrived." Thomas gave his daughter a puzzled look. "That's not how I understand it. Quinn told me himself that he came to Placerville because of you." "Because of me," Lillian repeated, confused. "How could that be? We'd never met before he arrived." "You'd better ask him that yourself," her father suggested as the carriage stopped before the church. "Here we are, Lily, ready." The question of Quinn's motives for coming to Placerville would have to wait. The church bells had begun to ring, summoning the wedding party and guests inside. Thomas helped his wife and daughter from the carriage, offering Lillian his arm for the walk up the church steps. Inside, the small sanctuary had been transformed with bouquets of wildflowers and aspen's branches beginning to turn golden. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow over the assembled guests who rose as Lillian appeared in the doorway. And there, waiting before Reverend Miller at the altar, stood Xavier Quinn. He'd never looked more handsome, dressed in a new black suit, his dark hair neatly combed, his blue eyes fixed on Lillian with an expression of such love and certainty that her earlier fears seemed absurd. The walk down the aisle felt both eternal and instantaneous. Lillian was acutely aware of the faces turned toward her smiling, approving, some damp with tears, but her gaze remained locked with Xavier's, drawing strength from his unwavering focus. When they reached the altar, Thomas placed Lillian's hand in Xavier's, the symbolic transfer of protection and care from father to husband. "Take care of her," he murmured. "With my life," Xavier promised. Reverend Miller began the ceremony, his familiar voice steady as he recited the traditional words. Lillian heard them as if from a distance, her attention centered on Xavier's hand holding hers, warm and strong and real. When the time came for their vows, Xavier's voice rang clear and true in the hushed church. "I, Xavier James Quinn, take you, Lillian Marie Harlow, to be my lawfully wedded wife. To have and to hold from this day forward for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." Lillian repeated the ancient promises, her voice growing stronger with each phrase. This time she knew the vows would be honored. This time the man before her would remain by her side through whatever challenges lay ahead. "By the authority vested in me," Reverend Miller concluded, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." He smiled at Xavier. "You may kiss your bride." Xavier's hands came up to frame Lillian's face, his touch gentle as he leaned down to claim her lips in their first kiss. It was brief, mindful of their audience, yet conveyed a depth of feeling that left Lillian breathless. "Mrs. Quinn," he whispered as they parted, a smile of pure joy illuminating his features. The bells pealed joyously as they walked back down the aisle, man and wife at last. Outside, the September sun shone brilliantly, the air crisp with the promise of autumn. The crowd that had gathered threw rice and flower petals, calling good wishes as Xavier handed Lillian into a waiting carriage, not the borrowed vehicle that had brought her to the church, but a handsome new buggy with gleaming brass fittings. "A wedding gift," Xavier explained as he climbed in beside her, "for our journeys together." The reception was held in the town square, tables laden with food contributed by friends and neighbors. Even the miners from the North Settlement had come, Simmons among them, sober and respectful as he offered congratulations to the couple who had extended credit when others wouldn't. As the celebration continued, Lillian found a moment to draw her new husband aside. "Papa said something strange before the ceremony," she began. "He said you told him you came to Placerville because of me. Is that true?" Xavier's expression turned serious. "It is." "But how? We'd never met." "Not formally, no." Xavier took both her hands in his. "But I saw you once, over a year ago, when I passed through Placerville on business. You were helping a child who'd fallen in the street, kneeling in the dust without concern for your dress, speaking so gently to the little boy that his tears stopped immediately." Lillian searched her memory but couldn't recall the incident. "I don't remember." "You wouldn't," Xavier acknowledged. "It was a small moment, unremarkable to you perhaps, but it stayed with me, your kindness, your beauty, the way the sun caught your hair." He smiled slightly. "I inquired about you afterward and learned you were engaged to be married. I wished you well and continued on my way." "But you came back," Lillian prompted when he paused. "I came back," Xavier confirmed. "Months later, I heard a rumor that the Harlow girl in Placerville had been jilted by her Denver fiancé. I told myself it wasn't my concern, that you wouldn't remember me even if we met." His expression softened. "But I couldn't stop thinking about you, about the sadness you must be feeling." Before I quite knew what I was doing, I'd sold my interests elsewhere and was riding toward Placerville. The revelation stunned Lillian. "You came all that way for someone you'd glimpsed once, someone who didn't even know you existed." "It sounds foolish when you put it that way," Xavier admitted with a rueful smile, "and perhaps it was. But I've learned to trust my instincts, and everything in me said I needed to be here, that there was someone worth finding in Placerville. So when you approached me that first day—" "I'd been watching you," Xavier confessed, "trying to find the right moment to introduce myself without seeming like a madman. When I saw you crying as the church bells rang, I knew I couldn't wait any longer." Lillian shook her head in wonder. "It's like something from a novel." "Life often is," Xavier replied, "if we're paying attention." He searched her face anxiously. "Are you angry that I didn't tell you sooner?" "Angry? No." Lillian squeezed his hands. "Amazed, yes, touched beyond words." She leaned up to brush a kiss across his cheek. "And grateful that you followed your instincts." "As am I," Xavier murmured, drawing her closer. "More than you can know." The celebration continued until dusk, when the newlyweds departed in their new buggy amid cheers and well wishes. Xavier drove not toward his rooms above the store, but out of town, following the road that wound along the creek. "Where are we going?" Lillian asked, curious. "Home," Xavier replied simply. "Our home." A mile outside Placerville, he turned onto a narrower track that Lillian had never explored. It led to a clearing in the pines where a house stood, a sturdy cabin with a wide porch and windows that glowed with lamplight. "When did you build this?" Lillian gasped, taking in the scene. "I began it the day after you agreed to marry me," Xavier said. "With help from some of the miners who were glad for the work. It's not grand, but it's solid and warm, with room to grow as our family does." Tears sprang to Lillian's eyes at the evidence of his planning, his faith in their future together. "It's perfect," she whispered. Xavier lifted her from the buggy and carried her across the threshold, setting her gently on her feet in a main room furnished with a mix of new pieces and a few Lillian recognized from her parents' home gifts to start their married life. "Welcome home, Mrs. Quinn," Xavier said softly, his arms encircling her waist. "Home," Lillian repeated, savoring the word and all it implied: security, belonging, love. She turned in his embrace to face him, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. "I never thought I could be this happy." "Nor I," Xavier admitted. For too many years, I wandered without purpose, without hope of finding a place or person to call my own. His blue eyes, so often guarded, held nothing but openness now. You've given me both, Lillian, a home, a future, a reason to be better than I was. You've given me just as much, Lillian countered. You saw me when others looked past. You valued what others dismissed. I love you, Xavier said simply. Yesterday, today, and all the tomorrows we'll share. As his lips met hers in a kiss that held both tenderness and promise, Lillian felt the last shadows of doubt dissolve. This was where she belonged, not with a man who made promises on paper, but with one whose actions proved his devotion every day. The bride who had once cried as the bells rang now smiled through happy tears as her cowboy husband held her close. Both certain they would never let each other go. Epilogue. 5 years later, the spring morning dawned clear and bright over the Quinn homestead. Lillian stood on the porch, watching as Xavier led their 3-year-old son, James, on a circuit around the corral on the back of a gentle pony. The boy's squeals of delight carried on the breeze, mingling with the sounds of chickens clucking in their yard and the distant hammering from the new schoolhouse being built at the edge of town. Placerville had changed in the 5 years since Lillian and Xavier's wedding. The mines had closed entirely, but unlike many similar towns that had withered into ghost towns, Placerville had flourished under new direction. Xavier's vision of a community based on sustainable enterprises had taken root, with sawmills, farming cooperatives, and small manufacturing businesses replacing mining as the town's economic foundation. The Quinn and Harlow mercantiles had merged 2 years earlier, Thomas gradually ceding control to his son-in-law as rheumatism made daily work increasingly difficult. Under Xavier's management, the business had expanded to include a postal service, a small lending library, and even rudimentary banking facilities for the region's growing population. But the greatest changes had come within the Quinn household. James Thomas Quinn had arrived 3 years earlier, followed by twin girls, Margaret and Elizabeth, now 18 months old and napping inside under the watchful eye of their grandmother. "Mama, look," James called, waving frantically as Xavier guided the pony toward the house. "I riding." "I see, sweetheart," Lillian called back, her heart full as she observed her son's excitement and her husband's patient instruction. "You're doing beautifully." Xavier looked up, his smile still capable of making Lillian's heart skip after 5 years of marriage. The silver at his temples had spread, lending him a distinguished appearance that suited his position as one of Placerville's most respected citizens. Few now remembered or mentioned the mysterious past of the cowboy who had ridden into town and never left. As they reached the porch, Xavier lifted James from the pony's back and set him on the ground. "Go find Grandma," he instructed. "Tell her what a good rider you were." The boy scampered into the house, already calling for his grandmother to listen to his tale. Xavier secured the pony to a hitching post before joining Lillian on the porch. "He's fearless," he observed, pride evident in his voice. "Takes after his mother that way," Lillian laughed. "I think you're confusing courage with stubbornness, a trait he certainly inherited from his father." Xavier pulled her close, dropping a kiss on the top of her head. "Perhaps he got the best and worst of both of us." "I hope so," Lillian murmured, leaning into his embrace, "though I pray none of our children ever face the hardships we did." "They won't," Xavier promised. "They'll grow up knowing they're loved, secure in who they are and where they belong." His voice held the certainty of a man who had found his own sense of belonging after years of searching. That makes all the difference in a life. Lillian nodded against his chest, thinking of the journey that had brought them to this moment, her broken engagement, his mysterious arrival, the slow building of trust and love between them. What had seemed like the end of her hopes had actually been the beginning of something far better than she dared to imagine. "I love you, Xavier Quinn," she said, looking up at the man who had ridden into town and changed everything. "Thank you for never letting me go." His blue eyes, as warm and steady as the day they'd wed, held hers. "Never," he agreed, sealing the promise with a kiss that still held all the tenderness and passion of their first, "not in this lifetime or any other." Inside, they could hear James recounting his adventure to his grandmother, his childish voice animated with excitement. Soon the twins would wake, demanding attention and affection that would be freely given. The day would unfold in the comfortable rhythm of family life meals to prepare, lessons to teach, work to complete, moments to treasure. It wasn't the life Lillian had envisioned when she'd agreed to marry Jonathan Prescott years ago. It was better, richer, more challenging, more rewarding than anything she could have planned. The path had been unexpected, marked by tears and bells and a cowboy who'd appeared when she needed him most. As they stood together on the porch of the home they'd built, both literally and figuratively, Lillian knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be, with exactly the right person by her side. Whatever the future might hold, they would face it together, never letting go of the love that had brought them home.